Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Tim with Junglebox, and today we're going to talk about moss. We were having a great conversation with our friend Vontrox on Instagram in regards to growing moss and how maybe we could put out some more specifics on how to really grow quality moss for your vivariums, terrariums, gecko enclosures, dart frog houses, all that kind of good stuff. If any of the products that you see here today interest you, we do have them for sale. Our website is coming soon, but in the meantime, you can contact us on Instagram or Facebook if you have any questions or need a little bit more guidance. We'll be happy to help. Okay, so we're going to talk about types of moss. And just to forewarn you guys, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a horticulturalist, I'm just a plant nerd at heart, and this is information I'm passing along to you based on my experience. I've got a lot of vivariums growing and I've grown a lot of moss in my time, and I'm just sharing with you what I've learned. So I'm going to break down moss into categories of 3 right now, and that is aquatic moss, tropical moss, and what we're going to call temperate moss. So I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where it is hotter than balls right now, 115, 118, 120. If you go hike Camelback Mountain, you know, it's desolate out there. There's no moisture. There's rocks and dirt and a couple of plants, right? Well, in the wintertime, when we get winter rain and the weather cools down, all of this moss starts to come out of the woodwork and little cracks and crevices and underneath rocks and stuff like that. That's what I'm going to call temperate moss. Those kind of mosses require a long, dry dormancy period. So while it might be tempting to want to put a moss like that into your vivarium, the answer is that's a no-go. That moss will eventually die. It's really hard to give it enough light because it's from the desert, and number 2, it doesn't perform well because it never gets into that dormancy period. So it'll grow for a little while and then it's going to start to decay and rot on you. Then you have your tropical and aquatic mosses. So aquatic mosses are ones that you'd see in aquascaping or growing in usually a freshwater aquarium. That's what we have right here on display, and we've actually found that these aquatic mosses grow really well in a humid vivarium enclosure. So this is Taxiphyllum Taiwan version, and then there's a couple of Vesicularia here. This is Vesicularia ferrii, which is a weeping type of moss. It's going to want to crawl down and over something. And then this is what's called Vesicularia dubiana, or Christmas moss, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And it tends to want to grow straight and flat across the ground. So we found that those mosses are really good mosses for vivariums, as well as the other tropical moss there's a million species, I'm sure. I don't know how to name them all even, but moss that you find, let's say on the top of a pot of a plant that you got, or it's snuck in on an orchid that you found at a cool show. All that kind of stuff can be propagated and made to grow well if you have the right environments. Okay, so we're going to talk about the growing conditions of moss and how to get the most out of it. Number 1 thing is lighting. You want to have pretty bright lights for growing moss. Probably over 6,500 Kelvin. We grow with T5 fluorescence. You can also use high-powered LEDs, but you will find that the closer you can get to a full spectrum like jungle sun light, the better experience and the better growth you're going to get from your moss. You can overlight moss. You'll know that because it'll start to turn a really, really, really light green, and sometimes even on the yellow side, and the growth won't be as vigorous. It'll look like it's kind of struggling a little bit. Some of the ends might brown a little bit, and that's an indication that it's not getting either A, enough water, or B, that it's just getting torched by too bright of a light, and maybe the temperature inside the vivarium is getting warm too. So those are things to watch out for. The next thing that's really important is water quality. You want to water with reverse osmosis water. Of course, if you're doing dart frogs or anything like that, you probably already know that, but no sink water, no tap water. Everybody's, I'm sure, is going to have their own opinion on this. I don't like to risk it, so I always just get reverse osmosis water from the store. The water store, or it's $1.25 to fill up a 5-gallon bucket or whatever that is. So you got to remember that even when you filter some waters, it doesn't always take out the hard minerals, sometimes calcium, sometimes chlorine, that reverse osmosis water will do. So if you think about rainwater, what's in it other than what it rinses off of the trees? There's not a lot of stuff in it, and that's what moss, really healthy moss, is getting on a daily basis, not water that's treated from a faucet. And so if you want to grow something well, you want to try to replicate its growing conditions as closely as possible. The other thing that's really important is airflow. Moss likes frequent wettings and then to let air move through the vivarium. So it's okay that it's humid, but if you're growing moss in a vivarium that is incredibly damp all the time, water dripping off of the sides constantly, hard to see into, algae growth on the sides, you're probably going to get into a situation where your moss may, what I'm going to call, eventually crash. Sometimes you'll see moss grow and it'll get this like white spiderwebby stuff over it, and it will start to just turn into this dark green mush. That's a mold or a fungi that's taken over that moss because it's not breathing well. It's staying too damp inside and it needs more airflow. So if you're trying to grow good moss, I would highly suggest getting a Mist King or an automatic misting system of some kind. Stay away from foggers. They're not a great idea, especially if you have animals in your enclosures. But a misting, even 5 seconds once an hour or 10 seconds once every 2 hours or whatever, it just adds enough moisture and allows you to be able to open up your vivarium more to airflow than if you're a person that's hand misting and say you work 12-hour days or whatever, so you've got to keep that lid on. That's okay because you want to keep that moisture up, but to grow really healthy moss, you want consistent small wettings and then followed by a lot of airflow. So those tips are going to really help you maximize growing your moss with those 3 basic elements. So light, air circulation, and water quality. Okay, so let's talk about growing substrates and the best way to get your moss a great foundation. The first thing that anytime you're going to mount moss to like a piece of driftwood or a branch that you found, you want to get it really nice and wet. I would recommend soaking it in RO water for a good, 3 or 4 days if you have the time, because it will help that wood start to really break down. Some of these woods are incredibly dense, and porosity is important for moss to take a good hold. So tree fern, we have these tree fern panels here. This is a great substrate for moss. It retains moisture and water, but it also has a lot of crevices and it has a lot of porosity so that moss can kind of penetrate and really get a good hold in that mat. It's almost like getting caught in like a spider's web, if you will. It just sticks in there and it grows. If moss likes to feel like it has a home, like a place to be. So if you're trying to get moss to grow on a really smooth branch or something that's not maybe as seasoned, it's a newer piece of wood, I would recommend putting a layer of sphagnum moss underneath the moss and in between the log that you're going to mount it on, and then using some monofilament line or fishing line, tack that on there in a couple places so that the moss has somewhere to be, that your frogs or geckos or whatever you have living in there don't knock it off, and then it has some time to establish itself. A piece like this is probably a good year's worth of growth from a piece that started off like the size of a dime, maybe 3 of them every now and then. So it's not super fast growing, but once it gets established and is growing in the conditions we talked about earlier, it should take off for you and stay very healthy. The other thing that moss really likes to grow on is decomposing leaf litter. So, guava leaves, mangrove leaves, Indian almond leaves, but not new, fresh, shiny ones, right? Some that have started to break down, like you know how they get in your bottom of your vivarium. If it's humid, it starts to kind of decompose. So something that you can do to, if you don't already have that in your vivarium, is again the same thing. Take your leaves and soak them for 4 or 5 days. Let them get really nice and sopping wet, and then then put your moss over them. The harder thing about leaves is that they're harder to tie something to, and they don't have a lot of weight to them. So in that scenario, I would suggest sometimes blending your moss in a blender. I know, crazy, right? So you can take one of these Tropica cups if you want, and you can put the moss, you rinse off the agar on the bottom of it, put it in a blender, and add some RO water to it and just pulse it a couple of times. And what that will do is it'll break up that moss so that you can get a more even coverage, and then just pour it over your leaf litter or the bottom of your vivarium. The nice thing about that is that it's going to be broken up into small enough pieces that if your frogs or your geckos move a couple of them, it's no big deal. It's just going to spread it around the vivarium. The other thing that you can also do is mix live moss with the sphagnum moss in a blender, and you need a pretty good blender to do it. I would suggest a Vitamix, that's what I've used. You pulse it a couple more times and give yourself, it's almost like an applesauce consistency, excuse me, and you can smear that, and what that'll do is allow that to get in all the cracks and the crevices of the piece of wood that you're trying to use, and that is the method that we used to do one of the pieces of wood in the vivarium you saw at the beginning of this video. That's how that was done. Now, what you've seen is about 8 months worth of growth, but it will happen, and it grows in super evenly when it does grow in. So that's how. That's what I would suggest growing your moss on. Worm castings are a great thing to use too. You can generally get them in a garden center. They will add a little bit of nitrogen to the area, and you, like for example, if you're trying to grow moss on a piece of rock or something like that, if you kind of smear some worm castings over the top of that to give some organic matter, generally there's got to be a little bit of organic decomposition happening for the moss to really be happening, but to be happy. But once it's there, it'll go crazy for you. So lots of luck. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned for our future videos. We'll start talking about a couple of more specific projects and how to make that moss work in unique ways for you. Stay tuned. We'll keep you posted. Thanks for tuning in.